Hi there. I'm making a video today to just explain what standards-based grading looks like in a classroom and using mine as an example for you. Standards-based grading is when you take a standard that you're trying to teach in your classroom. For example, mine right here is the Next Generation Science Standard that states plan an investigation to provide evidence that the change in an object's motion depends on the sum of forces on the object and the mass of the object. That is kind of a mouthful, but as an educator, it is our job to break it down by learning target. For example, I have one learning target that I would want my students to meet so that I would know that they are being proficient in this standard here is just being able to explain Newton's first law of motion. This is one of the earlier learning targets that I would teach in this unit covering this standard. And I would grade them based on their proficiency. And in my classroom specifically, my proficiency scale is from 0 to 4. And if you look here, you can see how I grade them. So for example, if a student receives a 0 from me, that is equivalent to attempted or it's failing. If you look at it in regards to percentages, if I give them a 1, it's emerging or they're beginning to know the concept. So it's definitely okay if students receive these scores because then you can look back later at it and be like, all right, my students got mostly 0s and 1s. I either didn't cover something very well, or maybe I didn't teach it in a way that they could understand. So that's one way that standards-based grading is really great. Otherwise, if they're receiving a 2, they're doing pretty well. That's about a C average in my class. 3 is meeting the standard, meaning that they can show me they're proficient in it, but then 4 is they're actually exceeding the standard. So they're able to apply Newton's first law of motion into many different contexts. If you look down here where I have evidence, this is just how I grade uh, based on how they're showing me if they're proficient. So if we look here, exceeds, like I said, they are proficient in the learning target slash part of the standard. So they use their knowledge that they know about Newton's first law of motion and they use it to explain how a skateboarder stays in motion after their skateboard stops. If a student can do that and apply this learning target, it means they got it, I taught it well, they understood it, they're going to do well on this portion of the test and or that area of expertise in the state test. Now, if my student meets the standard, but they're not quite able to put it into a specific phenomenon, um, then they have a 3 because they meet it, because they can explain Newton's first law of motion, but they're just not able to fully apply it to um, life experiences. So the goal of my class is to have a 3 and a 4 average. If they're having a 2, that means that I have to help them get to where they're supposed to be. For example, a student can start to explain Newton's first law of motion, gets a little confused, and you might prompt them with a question to get them back on track, and then they're able to finish answering the question. That would be a level 2 proficiency. When you're at a 1, they are struggling. And even with your assistance kind of guiding them through to the answer, they're still having a hard time coming to that. So they would receive a 1 for proficiency or like the beginning slash emerging state of it. And then 0 is they didn't really show any effort going into it. They don't know what Newton's first law is, but they knew Newton was a scientist. This student is typically would be considered one of your lower students in the class, and maybe this student gets fours on everything else, but just struggles with this learning target specifically, and that happens. Um, and in my grade book specifically, this might not be the same for you, but I have an M just meaning missing. Um, they either refused to complete the assignment or they didn't complete the assignment. Because a 0 in my grade book is not actually 0. I have to use an M to make it a 0. But that is a conversation in a different video that I hope to make soon. I am going to show you an example of how I've been using learning targets in my classroom. So in this case, these learning targets are based off of mostly the next generation science standards. As you can see, I have them listed here and so on and so forth. But for one unit of this year, I did use my state's standards just because I thought they were important. And also, I am required to make sure that I'm also hitting those standards as well as the next generation standards at my district. But an example for you, I will use space systems. Uh, the learning targets for this unit, I had 4 main ones that I tested them on, and they stated I can identify 2 primary causes for Earth's seasons and explain the difference between rotation and revolution. This kind of seems like a really big learning target, and it definitely is, but that's only because I took a few smaller learning targets and condense them so that I can have less grades in the grade book, because every grade in my grade book is based off of a learning target. So if I have 12 learning targets, I would, in theory, have 12 tests in the grade book because I want to know how my students are doing for each learning target. Um, but in this case, I condensed learning targets so that instead of having 12 tests, I just had 4 smaller assessments. So for this learning target, when I tested my students, they received um, between a 0 and a 4 if they completed the test. As you can tell, my students did pretty well. If it's blacked out, that just means that my student either didn't take the test or had a um, exempt on it. There are a couple students here that struggled with this learning target, and then I had many students that did extremely well on the learning target. What I did was I averaged this out. So the average here is 3.73, which tells me that the majority of the grade is going to do very well on this topic on our state test. Whereas this learning target over here, they struggled more on. The average was down to 2.8, which in my classroom is not meeting the standard. I can describe how mass and distance affect gravity's force. I had lots of ones, zeros, and twos on this topic, which either tells me that I did not teach it very well or it was just a more complex topic for them to grasp. So when it comes around to state testing time, I will use this data to look at what areas or what standards slash learning targets my students struggled on. You can see during our rocks and minerals unit, they struggled more. They had 2 learning targets that were in the red here, meaning not everyone was meeting that learning target. Um, one being I can classify and identify rocks using texture and composition. That's definitely a more difficult learning target for my middle schoolers. So they struggled a bit there. Again, here is just comparing the different ways rocks form, which is also another complex learning target. So you can see here that the scores are much lower on average. This is the unit that we are currently on. I plan to test them here soon and update it, and hopefully I will see my averages in the green because that is the ultimate goal. I'm just gonna real quick recap of what I talked about, just to kind of clarify. Standards-based grading is grading based on the standard, quite literally. It's in the name. So this standard here, if I open up the website for NGSS, it goes over what specifically needs to be taught within this standard. So you would take that information and you would write out some learning targets of what you need your students to be assessed on. From there, you take that, you teach your lessons, and then as you go about grading, you just grade them on their proficiency, how well they know it, if they're experts on it or not. Hopefully that you will be mostly 3s and 4s at the end of the unit, but at the beginning, when you're grading smaller formative assessments, they might be 0 through 2 because they're still gaining that knowledge and learning before they can fully understand and test out of that standard. I hope this video helped. I hope to be adding more videos in the future on this topic.